35 minutes. My colleague Nicole is here from NPR. We deal in 3 to 7 minutes, so 35 minutes should keep me busy for quite a while. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming on a really hot day. I just should say that because it's a great pleasure to not only have written a book, but have people come and want to hear about it. I'll tell you a little bit about the book and how I wrote it, and how I came to write yet another book about Harry Truman, and then hopefully I'll have time to take a few questions. A few weeks ago, just to set the stage a little bit, a United States Senator, Bernie Sanders it was, wrote a piece in the Atlantic magazine about runaway spending in the Pentagon budget. And by the way, we've all seen these stories our whole lives, the $80 toilet seat, the $150 wrench. This particular time, Sanders was really upset about runaway Pentagon spending. And here's what he wrote briefly. Our country spends, he wrote, with almost no debate, nearly $1 trillion a year on the military, while at the same time ignoring massive problems at home. It went into some political stuff from there. He cited a couple of examples. In 2022, the government awarded Lockheed Martin more than $45 billion in unclassified contracts. The company returned about 1/4 of that amount to shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks, and paid its CEO $25 million. So Sanders was on a rant about this, But the point I'm making is he gets to his point. There's a name for all this, war profiteering, and there's a solution too. Here's what he said. During World War II, then Senator Harry Truman decided to investigate the windfall profits made by military contractors who enriched themselves at the expense of millions of servicemen who risked death defending their country. So the question for me is, the question for us is, why did Sanders have to go back 80 years to find an example of a government solution to this problem? Well, it turns out that's exactly what I ended up writing a book about, and that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about how I came to do that. Before I talk about that a little bit, I should just ask, how many have read David McCullough's book about Truman? Anybody? Yeah, a lot, right? I've read it 3 times. It's one of my favorite books. And you might be asking yourself, after reading that book, how could there possibly be anything more to say about Harry Truman than is in that very fine book? But one of the things I noticed as I was reading that book, not the first time, but later on, is that the dramatic drama in the summer of 1944, as Franklin Roosevelt was ailing and the leaders of the Democratic Party very much did not want Henry Wallace to be the vice presidential candidate on the ticket. The few people in the know, the reason for that was most everybody knew that Roosevelt would not survive his 4th term, and that whoever became vice president was almost certainly going to be the next president of the United States. And the power structure in the Democratic Party very much did not want Henry Wallace to be that person. So there was this long drama beginning in early 1944, all the way up to the convention in Chicago in August of who was this going to be. Truman started off at the bottom of the list, 2%, a complete long shot, and he ends up in August 1944 becoming the vice presidential nominee for his party. On that summertime drama, 6 weeks, David McCullough spends 44 pages. It's a really great story, and I didn't really have to go and tell a whole lot of that story because many people, including McCullough, had told it before. But weirdly, the 3.5 years of Truman's life leading up to that summertime drama, those 3.5 years in which he learned how to be a national leader, he learned essentially on the job how to become a prominent national figure and job training to be president of the United States. In McCullough's book, 39 pages, less than 1 chapter. And that is kind of weird. And I've read many, many other biographies of Truman, and generally, I always feel like they're in a big hurry to get to the good stuff. You know, the atomic bomb and MacArthur and all this stuff of the Korean War, and they kind of skip over this period. And they'll talk all about his early years and his life as a farmer, and that failed haberdasher is the term some of you know about Truman. So, okay, that's how some years ago, well, let me tell you that. About 20 years ago, I was asked to write a magazine article about my hometown, Detroit. I'm from just outside Detroit, and about the Motor City's contributions to the war effort. Many of you know some of the story, Rosie the Riveter, tanks, guns, planes, all that sort of thing, produced in numbers. I saw in the little movie at the beginning of the museum tour today, they pretty much says, America produced more war materials than all the other nations combined. It's a great story, in my hometown, along with Pittsburgh and Portland, Oregon, and lots of other places, plays a big part of that. And that's how I started writing this magazine article. As you all know, Roosevelt said in one of his fireside chats, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. It is the greatest military buildup in the world history. Let me just give you some numbers. Even today, it's really unbelievable. 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 310,000 airplanes, 806,000 heavy trucks, 12.5 million rifles. My favorite number here, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. There's no way that the Germans or the Japanese could produce this. I mean, it's yes, there are battlefield victories, and you probably heard today about Dwight Eisenhower and his victory in Normandy, and all of those play huge parts in the winning of the war, but nor could they have happened without those 310,000 airplanes and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. So in researching this book about Detroit, I ran across reference to a bomber plant there, not too far from where I grew up and where my grandfather briefly worked. It's called Willow Run. It's in Ypsilanti, Michigan, not too far from Ann Arbor, where I went to school. It was basically the Henry Ford in his 80s saying, hey, we can make airplanes like we made Model Ts. On the assembly line, we'll crank them out. It was a good idea, and eventually, by the end of the war, this plant would produce a 4-engine bomber. It was called the B-24 Liberator. They could produce one bomber in this plant every 63 minutes. I've been to the plant. There's still bits and pieces of it left, but this place was rolling out bombers like you can't believe. But in the early days in 1941 and 1942, there were no bombers coming out of there. There were some major problems. One, 30,000 people, including my grandparents, had to work in this plant. There were no housing for them to live in anywhere nearby. My grandparents lived in wartime housing with bed sheets put up between the studs because there were no walls. It wasn't finished yet. And the government was constantly, they would get reports back from the front line. Hey, we need a machine gun here. We need some more armor plating there. The military was constantly, while the planes are on the assembly line, saying, oh, you got to do this, or you got to make these changes. And Edsel Ford had a stack of anyway, there were all kinds of problems. The press was beginning to call this plant Will It Run? So I ran across a reference in my research for this magazine article of something called the Truman Committee coming to investigate. And they showed up in Ann Arbor at the train station. They went over to Willow Run. They got the tour and everything. And a long time ago, I was like, what the heck is the Truman Committee? Which led me down, as we do these days, to a pretty long internet rabbit hole of reading. And one of the lucky things, these presidential libraries are awesome. One of the lucky things they've done at the Truman Library in Missouri is digitize a lot of their stuff. And what I found just in an internet search was oral histories from some of the young people hired to work on the Truman Committee. Truman got his little committee, and I'll tell about that in a bit. The Senate tossed him a bone. So here's the thing. He proposes this committee in 1941. Okay, here's a Democratic senator saying, you know what, I think we should be investigating the defense buildup right now. This is an unknown Democratic senator saying, I want to investigate and poke my nose into the business of the Democratic administration's handling of defense spending. Nobody, including Franklin Roosevelt, thought that was a good idea at all. The only reason Truman got to do this was it quickly became clear, as you can imagine, that if a Democrat didn't do such an investigation, the Republicans were happy to do it. And there were many, many such investigations during the war. So Truman got his little committee, and he turned it in 3 years into the most powerful congressional investigating arm the nation had ever seen. It's the reason 80 years later that Bernie Sanders is talking about it. And if you can Google it, and every time there's some giant government spending bill in Washington, somebody comes up and says, gosh, we should have another Truman Committee to look into this. So that's the story. That's the story I get to tell. And part of the cool part that got me into it was, yes, Truman himself, but these oral history accounts online at the Truman Library. Basically, Truman hired a top prosecutor. He went to the Attorney General of the United States and he said, give me your best prosecutor. 36-year-old prosecutor named Hugh Fulton in New York City. He had just put the head of a utility company in jail for 20 years for stealing $200 million from the public utility concern. He hired Hugh Fulton, and between the two of them, they hired a bunch of young kids, many of them right out of college or law school. One of them was a guy named Bob Irvin. In 1941, he was 23 years old, just graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, go blue. He came to Washington looking for a job, and somebody said, hey, you know, there's an opening over at this Senate committee thing. And again, I know all this because Bob Irvin, years later, gave an oral history to the Truman Library, and lucky for me, the transcript is online, and I started reading these things. And Bob Irvin was writing, and several of the other, there's a woman named Shirley Key who left a lovely oral history. She was a secretary on the committee and rose up to be the chief administrative officer for Hugh Fulton, the chief counsel. And many of them were saying, this is the best job I ever had in my life. Here they were, 23 years old, suddenly in the very center of the biggest conflict the world had ever known. They're working literally in the Capitol building every day and in the Senate office building. People they're reading about, Shirley Key says in her oral history, people I was reading about in the papers every day, generals, admirals, captains of industry are coming in and I'm talking to them. This was super exciting stuff. Bob Irvin found himself going undercover in steel plants around the country or a shipyard all over the country. They found this was terribly exciting work. And basically, one by one, they're saying, I came to work in this committee. Nobody asked me who I voted for. Nobody cared what my party was. They just wanted to know, could I do the job? And it was super rewarding. And so I'm reading this stuff or as a kind of a hobby in my sidelight, and I'm kind of like, my profession is a reporter, and so as a reporter in me is kind of like, I think there's a story here. And that led me a long time later to about 4 or 5 years ago saying, you know what, I think I'm going to try and write a book here, and I think there's a story here. And again, I felt like David McCullough and others had kind of skipped over it in their hurry to get all the good stuff. Lucky for me, I live in Washington, D.C., or right outside of it, and right down the street from NPR's headquarters is the National Archives, and there's awesome, friendly people there. Also, there are 700 linear feet of the records on the shelves there of the Truman Committee. That's basically, you know, they take the files and put them in a box, right? One of those file boxes, and then 2 and 3 and 4. And so 4 of those boxes are about 1 linear foot. So there are 700 linear feet. I've now been through most of them. And there's fascinating, awesome, amazing stuff in here. So let me jump ahead to the story itself. My book, my story begins on a cold winter day in 1941 on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. I used to live right across the street from this building where a senator lived. And on a cold morning, Harry Truman walked out of his apartment and climbed into his car and drove away. And that's basically both literally and metaphorically the first steps of a journey that would take him 3 years later to the White House. He was on his way to Missouri. Truman had been in the Senate for 6 years. In that time, he had done almost nothing of note. He had sat there quietly. He had learned. He had been a loyal soldier for the New Deal. Most of the people who even knew of him in Washington considered him corrupt, or at least suspected he was, because he had been nominated, handpicked by the Kansas City political boss, a man named Tom Pendergast, to put him in the Senate. And so often in the press and in Washington dinner parties, Truman was known as the senator from Pendergast. He ran for re-election in 1940. Nobody, including Franklin Roosevelt, really wanted him to win, but he squeaked by, largely because his opponent, Lloyd Stark, was former governor and fairly racist politician, and Truman had a lot more going for him than people recognized in Washington. There was more to him. You couldn't win a statewide political office just by being the tool of the Kansas City machine. Truman had been a farmer, an actual real hardworking farmer. He knew what it was like to get up at 4 in the morning, and when he went out in the country, he talked the farmer's language. He was a combat veteran, and he had commanded an artillery battery in the First World War, and his men were very devoted to him, Captain Harry, they called him. And so he won re-election. And he came back to Washington in late 1940, early 1941, and he was getting letters from his constituents, a lot of letters from people. So as you know, the United States was not in the war yet. It was still a year away from Pearl Harbor, but war had been raging since September 39, since in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt knew that the United States would eventually be drawn into this war, and he was doing everything he can within public opinion to prepare the United States for this war. However, as often happens in American history, the United States, once again, the Civil War, World War I, you name it, woefully unprepared for the war that was coming and that Roosevelt and others knew was happening. At this time, the United States Army was 18th in the world in size, right behind Romania, well-known world superpower. And so all over the country, the race was on. The United States needed airplanes, it needed tanks, it needed soldiers, it needed sailors, everything, you name it. So all over the country, Roosevelt was doing what he could to push through defense spending bills. And all over the country, if we were going to, eventually the United States Army would go from a couple of 100,000 to 13 million people in uniform. They would need uniforms and food to eat and rifles to shoot with and helmets, but they would also need army camps to train and live, and they would need cots to sleep in, all this stuff. Truman was getting letters from a place called Fort Leonard Wood. It was an army camp under construction in the Missouri Ozarks. And the letter writers were writing in saying, Senator, something funny's going on here. People are getting rich, a lot of time being wasted, or whatever, something's not right here. One of the fun things about Truman, and what makes him a fun guy to write about, he didn't send out a staffer to check things out. He didn't get on a plane with reporters and a congressional delegation. No, he walked out of his car in Washington, D.C., all by himself, and he drove to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. And he showed up, a very well-dressed man in a double-breasted suit, walking around quietly, asking questions. And he saw what the letter writers had told him. He saw stacks of lumber rotting in the snow. He saw men sitting around playing cards. He saw contractors making 3, 4, 5, 10 times the profit they had made before this defense buildup. And he kept going. He went on to several more states, and he saw the same thing. So in February 1941, he came back to Washington hopping mad, to use one of the more repeatable in a family newspaper terms. Truman had a filthy mouth, by the way. He learned how to swear in his 20s, and he often said it served him well throughout his life. But anyway, he came back, and he got up on the Senate floor on February 10th. He said, you know what, we should have a committee to look into this. This is not acceptable. We're wasting the taxpayers' money. Our soldiers and sailors and airmen need the best equipment that they can have. I think we should look into this. Truman knew that after World War I, there were 117 separate congressional investigations looking into the war buildup or whatever. Truman's point, and a good one, was why do this after the war? Why don't we do it now while we can save some money and make things run better? So, as I said before, the Senate tossed him a bone, $15,000. Here's your little committee. He hired Hugh Fulton. He hired a few of these young staffers. Many of them he parked on the payroll of the Social Security Administration or the Federal Trade Commission or whatever because he couldn't afford them. And as I said, they turned them into this giant, powerful investigating arm that we still talk about today. Their first big report was on these army camps, and basically it was a bombshell. The New York Times and pretty much everybody else in the country had it on the front page the next day, and the headline was $100 million wasted in army camps. I don't even know what the amount, how that translates into 2024 dollars, but it's a lot. It was a lot of money. $100 million was a lot of money even back then. And from there, they kept going. They moved on. What American learned from the Truman, the next big report was on aircraft production. We're used in this country, Americans, we're the best. We like our stuff the best. And often what the Americans learned from the Truman Committee was difficult news that they didn't really like to hear. And what the second big report on airplanes said was that the bombers American pilots were flying were good, some of the best in the world. The B-24 bomber, which I've mentioned, the B-17 Flying Fortress, these were world-class bombing airplanes, and we were doing a good job there. But the fighter planes that U.S. pilots were fighting at this time were not nearly as good as the ones that German and Japanese and British pilots were taking flight to the skies in, were way better. Nobody liked hearing that very much, but it was the truth. And from there, report after report. A couple of cool things the Truman Committee did that are still relevant to today. Truman tried everything he could to keep opinions out of these things and just do the facts. Hugh Fulton, the prosecutor, Let's just stick to the facts. Let's keep the opinions out of there. There were 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the committee. One of the things Truman was proudest of later in his life was that during his time as chairman, the Truman Committee put out 32 reports. Every single one of them was unanimous and bipartisan. There was not a single dissenting vote in the time that Truman was chairman of the committee. For somebody who lives and works in the Washington, D.C. of today, this is a very hard thing to imagine. I can tell you it was a lot of pleasure over the last 4 years, spending a lot of time in 1943 instead of 2023. It's an inspiring thing, and that's what I read in these oral history accounts. These people saying, listen, we were out there fighting the good fight here. One of the biggest of their investigations was in early 1943. The headlines on all over the country, every newspaper in the country, the 2 words were fake steel. And so let me back up a second. I mentioned early on in this committee, one of the cool things Truman did, he went on the radio. As you know, at this time, especially compared to his predecessor in the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman was a terrible public speaker, or at least a very inexperienced one. He went on the radio a few times, but one of the cool things he did with the committee was say, hey, Americans, we need your help. You see something going on down at the factory, something wrong at the shipyard, if you have an idea for winning the war, drop us a note. Harry S. Truman, Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. Pretty much that's very close to what he said on the radio. And people started writing into him. A few at first, but by the end of the war, about 100 letters a day coming into the Truman Committee. As I've said, I've read many of them in the National Archives. I'm going to share one with you in a little bit. But it's a really amazing thing to read these letters there, and they're really kind of inspiring. But one of the guys in early 1942, there was a steel worker, a supervisor of inspections at a steel plant in Pittsburgh. It's called the Irvin Works. It was run by the Carnegie Illinois Steel Company, which was a division of U.S. Steel. And this guy's name was George Dye, and one night, on a cold winter night in 1942, he sat down at his kitchen table on Brownsville Road in Pittsburgh, and he wrote Truman a letter. I've seen the letter. It's about 6 pages long. It's written in pencil. It's written like a high school book report. Dear Senator Truman, it's very nice, it's charming. However, it's so full of the jargon and technical details of the steel building inspecting industry that you can barely understand it. And at the same, and I've read it, and I have no idea what this person is saying. And neither did the young lawyers and staffers on the Truman Committee. One of the rules Truman and Hugh Fulton had set was that everybody who wrote to the Truman Committee would get a response. Every single letter that came into the committee got a written response. Oftentimes it was what we now call a brush off, Dear so-and-so, thank you very much for your letter about X. I can assure you the Truman Committee will take this under serious consideration, best, blah, blah, blah. They got a response at least, it wasn't a serious one. Well, while serious letters were coming in, there were also a lot of what the Truman Committee staffers called crackpots. People writing in with all kinds of wacky ideas. Truman had a favorite. He told this throughout the rest of his life. He encountered somebody whose idea for winning the war was that every American soldier would get their own personal airplane. And at a certain point, each one of these airplanes would be filled up with dirt, good U.S. American dirt. And at a given moment, they would all take off, and some of them would fly over Tokyo, and some of them would fly over Berlin, and they would drop this dirt on those cities, burying them in U.S. soil and thus winning the war. I say that because there's so many different comical ideas in the letters and the files. And so they got a nice response, and they went into what everybody on the committee called the crackpot file. Well, this guy from Pittsburgh was writing such wacky stuff with equations and all kinds of incomprehensible stuff that they went into the crackpot file. George Dye got the brush-off letter. He wrote another letter. He got the brush-off, and he wrote a few more. And even some of them, you can read him saying, listen, if I'm a nuisance, please let me know. I'll stop writing to you. But he didn't. He kept on writing. At one point, he came to Washington, D.C. in July of 1942. He even got a meeting with Hugh Fulton, who wrote to Carnegie Illinois Steel. I couldn't find any response, but nothing ever came of it. And he went back, and he still, every 2-3 weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, he was dashing off these letters to the Truman Committee. until March 1943. So the Truman Committee was holding that week hearings on efficiency. How can we reduce absenteeism in the workforce? How can we increase production? How can we make our factories more efficient? And one of the people they had called to testify that week was a man named Henry Kaiser. Many people, clearly some people know who he is, many people have now forgotten about Henry Kaiser except for one thing. Who knows what that is? Cars, yes, okay, that's a good one. But I'm from Detroit. Many of our colleagues here who have not heard of the Kaiser, Darren, yeah. One thing he did was, what were you saying? Kaiser created a health care plan for his workers. We now call it Kaiser Permanente. It's almost the only thing he's noted about today. On that day in the committee, he told the senators, he said, listen, I've come up with a really cool idea. For 7 cents a day, my workers pay into this thing. Many of them have never been to a doctor in their whole lives. But now they can go to a doctor for some simple thing, they'll get treatment, and it's cut down absenteeism X% or whatever. So he was talking about all these miracles of production until one of the senators, a Republican from Maine named Owen Brewster, asked Kaiser a question. Senator, Mr. Kaiser, what about that ship that broke up? Well, here's the story. 3 months earlier, on the night of January 16th, 1943, in one of these amazing shipyards, Henry Kaiser was a production miracle. He built the Hoover Dam is one of the things. But in early 1940 and 41, this man was making shipyards appear like this overnight up and down the West Coast, and was solving one of the key problems in the war was, if we were going to save Great Britain, how would we get millions of men and uniforms and tanks and airplanes and equipment and nurses and all kinds, how would we get all this stuff across the ocean? We needed a lot of merchant ships. What was the problem with that? Well, German submarines were lurking under the surface, sinking those merchant ships faster than the United States or Great Britain or anybody else could build them. Kaiser had made these shipyards appear. A committee had created a new kind of a very basic, simple, not very modern merchant ship. They were called Liberty ships. There's only a couple of them left. You can go see one. I think it's in San Francisco. But anyway, these Liberty ships. Before World War II, it took about a year to make a merchant ship from start to finish. By the end of the war, Henry Kaiser could do it in less than a month. This is just, it's like the bomber plan I described, these amazing miracles of ships coming out of there. But on the cold night of January 16th, 1943 in Portland, Oregon, brand new shipyard, the very first ship to be built there, an oil tanker called the SS Schenectady. It was sitting there, it's 543 feet long, sitting there quietly in calm water. They're loading it up for its very first voyage, when all of a sudden at 10:30 p.m. a noise was heard, an explosion it sounded like. People heard it a mile away. They felt the earth shake. The firefighters raced to the scene. The police are called. The FBI is coming because, of course, this is wartime now, and they think it's sabotage. And what they see is the Schenectady. Basically, there's a picture in my book. You can see it if you look. It looked like a giant. It picked up this brand new ship and cracked it in two and set it right gently back down in the water, broken right down the middle. Investigation turned out it wasn't sabotage. If it was an explosion, the metal would have blown outward, right? It's just sitting there, broken in two. Nobody knows. There are all kinds of investigations underway. What the hell happened to this ship? No one knows. Until 3 months later, when Henry Kaiser is sitting in a Senate hearing room in Washington, D.C., and Owen Brewster says to him, "So, Mr. Kaiser, what happened to that ship that broke up?" And Kaiser, weirdly, I've read the transcripts, Kaiser did not want to answer this question. You sure you want me to answer that? And Brewster was like, yeah, why don't you answer it? You really want me to answer? Yes. So Kaiser has a piece of paper in his hand, and he says, well, what I'm told by the experts is that the ship broke up because of bad steel. Bad steel coming out of the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Corporation in Pittsburgh. The questioning by the senators moved on that day, but all of the young staffers knew that 50 feet away in their office was a thick file of letters from an inspector at that very steel plant saying bad steel is coming out of this factory every single day. Truman sends 3 of them up to Pittsburgh. They sit in George Dye's kitchen that night, late that night. He draws them a map of the factory. Again, it's in the archives file. It's very weird to read about this, and then you actually going through these thousands of documents, and sure enough, there's his little map that he's drawn. And it's almost like a pirate ship thing, literally like there's an X on there. This is where the inspection record is. They go into the plant the next day and they say, gosh, this is a great factory. You guys are setting production records all over the place. Wow, this is amazing. We're here from the Truman Committee. We'd love to get a tour. Sure. They hook them up with a car. They take them out of the plant. And as they go through the plant, and it is, by the way, a very impressive plant. It's still there. It's called the Irvin Works. And it's a rolling strip mill where they do amazing things with giant hunks of steel heated red hot. But they're going through and they start to ask more and more pointed questions. How do you keep track of all the steel? You must inspect it, right? Oh, yeah, we keep track of it. What do you write down all the information? Yeah. Keep records of that? Sure. Can we take a look at them? As Bob Irvin, the young guy, said, there our warm reception ended and everything turned to ice. All of a sudden the stonewalling begins. Those inspections are too complicated. You wouldn't understand them. Well, we'd like to see them anyway. Well, it'll take a long, long time to pull them all together. I don't even know where they're at. Well, the inspectors from the Truman Committee did because George Dye had told them. They were in a room 10 feet away, right where they were standing. The Truman Committee, though, wasn't a law enforcement agency. They were just Senate investigators. They had no actual powers except one, which was subpoena power. So by now, they're totally getting shut down by the thing. The president of Carnegie, Illinois says, I'm not letting you do anything until I talk to Senator Truman. Truman is unavailable. They say, come back the next morning. By this time, they've reached out to Truman. They come back the next day and finally they say, okay, you can look at the inspection records, but that's it. So that was the one thing. Truman was a very calm guy. Throughout this investigation, he had no interest in embarrassing President Roosevelt or the Roosevelt administration or the military or frankly U.S. Steel or the Dayton Wright North American Aviation. But Truman, as I said, Truman had a temper, and it was when he got stonewalled by the military or somebody else, when they lied to him, when they told him no, that's when he would say, okay, we'll do this the hard way. Here's your subpoena. We'd like you here. And basically he said to the Steel executives, we'd like you in Washington Tuesday morning, where we'll be having a full hearing and we will have the press there. And sure enough, they did. And so I'll tell you one last story about the Steel investigation. So they finally get the Steel inspection records, right? And they're talking to them, oh, so why are some of these inspection records in pencil? Oh, yeah, that's sometimes we don't have the actual piece of paper. We have to call the mill. This mill didn't make steel. It just processed steel made at other plants. It hammered and shaped it and whatever. It took big steel slabs and shaped them into, a plate to go on a ship or a plate to go into a truck or whatever use was needed of it. Well, so they said, well, sometimes we don't have the actual inspection records. We have to call them up. Okay. Well, they said, the next question, how come some of these entries have an F written next to them, a capital F in pencil? So they're looking down at the young secretary. Her name is Irene Pasternak, who kept the inspection book, and she's looking around. And finally, she looks up at her boss, who stammers a bit, and then he says, oh, F, that means phone. Well, these were college graduates, these inspectors. They knew that phone didn't start with an F. And they took Miss Pasternak into a room, and they said, listen, without these bosses around, they said, you need to tell us the truth. And she said, F means fake. These are fake steel inspections, and this is fake steel. It's one of those moments when, as a journalist or a lawyer or a writer of history, this is the gold mine moment right there. And I'm looking at these documents in my hand, and there's the actual records, F, penciled in on there. So they come back to Washington. They hold a hearing, and same thing, front page across the country. Fake steel going into Navy ships. Fake steel going all over the country, going to the British Navy. Fake steel going into merchant vessels all over the country. And so by this time in 1943, Harry Truman is no longer the unknown politician he was 2 years ago. He's become a powerful figure. And it's fun for me, it was fun to watch him learning on the job, learning how to talk back. He was a captain. He was a captain in the Army, but here he is suddenly he's talking to the Secretary of the Navy or the Secretary of War or George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, or the CEO of United States Steel, and not talking in polite deferential terms when he needed to, but saying, what the hell is going on in your factory over there? There's a great exchange, and I put it in the book, I don't know it verbatim, where he's interviewing Benjamin Fairless, the head of U.S. Steel. How many people have you fired as a result of this? What? How many people, simple question, how many people have you fired? Well, nobody yet, but we're going to make some change. He's basically Truman, in classic Truman way. He's a lot of fun to write about. Truman basically says, I would have fired the whole bunch if I was you. And of course, that's what goes into the newspaper the next day. So Truman, that same week of the Steele investigation, Truman finds himself on the cover of Time magazine, which thankfully gave me the title of my, oh, there it is right there. Look at this. Oh my gosh. Wow, you guys, is this the best crowd or whatever? March 8th, 1943. I don't even need, is that what it says? Yeah. Did I get it right? Number 10, oh, I can't, oh yeah, there it is, March 8th, 1943. There he is on the cover. I'll tell you a funny story about the cover in a second. And the cool headline, Investigator Truman, a democracy has to keep an eye on itself. Anybody thought about that lately? The headline inside on a very good story about Truman is $1 Billion Watchdog, which I confess led to the title of my book without quite stealing from Time magazine. The only thing about this, you can see, you can't see it here. The only thing about this is Truman, somehow he looks very wrinkled. He looks very wrinkled in the cover. The artist drew the picture. And when I was in the Truman Library in Missouri, Truman maybe wrote 20 letters the week after this came out saying, I don't know why they made me look 80 years old. He wrote a letter to Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine, saying, hey, thanks a lot for that nice article, but what the heck were you thinking making me look so old? Anyway, it was very, Truman, like any other politician, was vain. One of the fun things during the war and reading all of his letters, it was lucky for me, his wife, Bess, really hated Washington, D.C., and she would get out of town as often as she can, and as an author, that is very lucky for me, because every night that she was away, Truman wrote her a letter, and it enables you to follow along what he had for lunch that day or what he was thinking or whatever. So by this time, he's a famous guy, and he's suddenly a nationally prominent guy, and he's being considered for higher office. And one of the things I want to end with was this. And I'll take some questions. Now, I could have talked about Higgins votes, but I'll skip that investigations. But as I said, one of the things that made Truman so popular was that somehow he had struck a chord with the American people. Here was somebody in Washington that they felt like they could trust. Sometimes he was giving them bad news that they didn't want to hear, or that certainly Franklin Roosevelt or the military didn't want them to hear. But also they felt like here was a guy, a simple guy, who was looking out for their interest. And over and over again, Americans sat down at the kitchen table at a typewriter or took up a pencil or a pen, sometimes a telegraph, and they wrote to him about it. And I thought I've seen thousands of them, but I just want to share one of them with you, because it's the kind of thing that helped make me decide that I might write a book about this. Here it is. On March 27th, 1943, this is a guy named John Duggan Jr. who lived in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. And here's his letter. Dear Senator Truman, on behalf of myself, and I'm sure millions of other fathers who have boys in actual combat service, I want to congratulate you and your committee on the wonderful public service you have rendered the nation. Any attempt to cover up acts which in effect are sabotage against our own boys by placing the responsibility on the so-called hirelings or underlings and permitting those that frame the policy of the concern to escape would certainly be considered in the nature of a whitewash. I have 2 sons, a brother and a son-in-law in the combat forces of the nation. 2 are at present overseas, and the others will probably go in due time. It's one hell of a situation when you and myself and millions of others who have boys risking their lives are compelled to submit to a thing of this sort, that additional profits might fall into the coffers of the Steel Company. Stay in there and pitch, Senator. You and your committee have done a swell job. Very respectfully yours, John Duggan Jr. Well, as you know, Truman resigned from the committee in August 1944 to join the ticket and run for the vice presidency, and the rest, as they say, is history. I'm happy to take a question or two if you like. Thank you. Sir, right here and then right here.
Early on in your book, you talk about the committee
Yep.
in the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And how Robert E. Lee made a quote about it was worth 2 divisions. I know this is really the topic. Could you comment on that briefly?
Sure. So one of the things Truman, it's weird. Truman, by the way, another cool thing about Truman, he is the last president and the only one of the 20th century, I believe, who didn't go to college. But he was an extremely well-read person. And one of the things that he did in those first 6 years in the Senate was he sat and he listened and he did a lot of reading. When he was considering this committee, he actually went over to the Library of Congress and he read many volumes. It was called, I think, the Committee on the Conduct of the War. It was run by Senator, I think, named Benjamin Wade of Ohio. Someone correct me. Truman called him a son of a bitch, but basically Truman often said, this committee, same thing from the president's own party, Republican senators caused Abe Lincoln no end of trouble. They were constantly telling him how to run the war, what he should be doing wrong. They were revealing in the newspapers military secrets, all kinds of stuff. Truman read these documents and he learned from them and he set out to expressly not do that. And one of the things that both helped him politically and in getting permission to have this committee was he made it very clear to Roosevelt and others. He would not look into military strategy. He would not tell Roosevelt what general to put in charge of the war or when he should invade France. They completely and carefully avoided any discussions of military strategy. Their job was to look into the defense program and make sure that the stuff was getting to the combat fronts. And it was a direct result of Truman's familiarity with the conduct of the Committee of the War. Sir?
I saw many years ago a movie on HBO, which was a biography of Harry Truman, and they mentioned in this movie that he was approached by the Secretary of War at some point when he was starting to investigate
Yep.
the atomic bomb project, and they told him, "Look, we're not going to tell you nothing. Just go away." And
Yep.
he went in the movie, just went away and didn't. Is that actually true?
Very close to being true, yes. So, as you can imagine, they're getting these letters all over. Truman, the stack of letters from Hanford, Washington, from Los Alamos, New Mexico, and from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, writing in saying, Senator, you need to, they're spending billions out here. They're buying up farmland, this stuff's going to waste, you need to check this out. Truman sent an investigator up to Hanford, Washington. Boom, he gets a telegram. It's basically a telegram saying, no one will talk to me, they've all been told to shut up. Next thing you know, George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, shows up in Truman's office and gives him the heads up. Back off. And then the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, there's a phone record of him talking to Truman, and basically he's like, listen, Senator, your guy called me up about this. I need to tell you this is, and Truman basically, and he knew a little bit about it, Truman basically agreed to back off.
Do you think he had some idea there was something like this bomb?
He did. I know, and we know this. He didn't know nothing about it. We know this because weirdly, after he talked to Stimson and Marshall, he wrote a letter to his old friend Louis Schwellenberger, who had been a senator and was now a federal judge in Washington. And in a letter in the U.S. mail, which was typed up by his secretary, Truman described a giant bomb that could make a huge explosion, and he wrote a letter saying, yeah, this is why all this stuff's going on right now. An incredible breach of security, which had anyone known about, Truman would have gotten in big trouble. So he did have some inkling of the bomb, but the other part of the story is, though, when he became vice president, that's all he knew, a big giant bomb. When he became vice president and then until he became president, nobody, including Roosevelt, thought to fill him in on this. It's absolutely bizarre. Again, the relationship, Bill, you and I were just talking about that. The relationship between Truman and Roosevelt was a weird one. I found a document in the Truman Library in Missouri written at the request, or written here in this library at their request in Missouri. How many times had Truman and Roosevelt actually met in the 10 years he was in the United States Senate? 6 times, mostly for about 15 minutes. They had no relation.
Secretly, that Roosevelt resented Truman because of his committee he was on. He was uncovering a lot of stuff in his administration that just wasn't.
Yeah, Roosevelt was not happy about a lot of this stuff. It was hard to, Truman was successful. It was hard to argue with. So, yeah, a couple of things. Truman screwed up a couple times. One time he shot off his mouth to a reporter, and it got into the press. That came very, very close to saying, oh, some of these problems in the military buildup, who's responsible for that? Yeah, and Truman himself felt the cold shoulder from the White House for about 6 months, so there's some of that. The other thing is, I think my impression has always been, again, I'm not a historian, so I'm just giving you my impression. Roosevelt cared very little who was vice president of the United States, and like most vice presidents of the United States, Wallace or whoever went off to ceremonial duties or whatever. So I don't, but Roosevelt had zero relationship with Truman, was a minor guy. He, a couple of times, was gently praiseful of the committee's work because he had to be. But also, Truman played him smart. On the very first big report, their first annual report, that was going to say that the Roosevelt's running of the war defense program was a hot mess. Truman was a smart politician. 3 days before the report came out, he took it to Roosevelt and gave him a copy, and Roosevelt used it as political cover to make some changes he wanted to make anyway. He kicked out the two people who were running the defense program. He named a Sears Roebuck executive named Donald Nelson to become the production czar. Truman, in his memoirs, literally writes, he says, I didn't care who got the credit, I just wanted the job done. And so Truman was a smart politician, and he would often give Roosevelt the heads up if he knew bad news was coming. Smart. I mean, again, just makes sense. Yes, ma'am. One last question, then we'll go sign some books.
During that first investigation by the Truman Commission on the steel company that
Yep.
was making fake steel, did any of those the CEO and all the other top officers of the company ever get into any trouble?
Well, of course not. I mean, that's an easy way to say, but we know how it happens today. They did what corporations do nowadays. The same. I mean, we know this is one of the things that these things go forward. No, a few people got fired, low down underlings got fired, and that was pretty much the end of it. There was a grand jury investigation into criminal charges that never went anywhere. Some of their investigations, one into an airplane engine factory in Ohio, led to the court-martial of 3 inspectors or whatever. But the same thing happens nowadays. During the war, you can see it happening. Big corporations learn how to fight back. The steel companies, 2 months later, there's stories in the press. Oh, all this inspection stuff, we're not making enough steel. There's a steel slump. And you can see North American Aviation did it on their criticism of the airplane engine factory. They start coming out, but we didn't do anything wrong here. Everything's fine here. The charges made by the Truman Committee are completely without blah, 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 blah. In my business today, in journalism, we call that a pre-buttal now, where you see the bad story coming and you come out and try and get out in front of it. I saw big corporations, they got burned by the Truman Committee the first few times, and I saw them literally learning how to fight back. And these are still the things we see today. Like I said, this stuff about Pentagon spending and $80 wrenches and stuff, these things still exist, and there's still this need for congressional oversight today. It's probably a good place to stop, right? Yeah. Thank you all very much.